Our lecture today is going to be on the Baroque. And the Baroque is sometimes referred to as the art of ecstasy. When we look back at what we've been studying so far in this course, we've seen art emerge from the Dark Ages and into the Renaissance. We've seen the emergence of humanism, the technique of art being perfected, such as in linear and atmospheric perspective, the use of chiaroscuro. We've also seen experimentation done by the great artists such as Da Vinci and Michelangelo during the 1500s. The Baroque takes it another step further, and this art is really art that's over the top. It's very theatrical. The word itself comes from a Portuguese word, Baroco. Baroco is a jeweler's term that describes an irregularly shaped pearl, something that is both beautiful, fascinating, and strange. The time period for the Baroque is pretty much like the Renaissance. We chop it up into a nice, clean 100-year century. So from roughly 1600 on up to 1700. Now, over the past few weeks, when we've looked at the Renaissance, we've pretty much been focused on Italy, with the exception of our chapter in Northern Europe. However, the Baroque is much more widespread. Absolutely, we have it in Italy. In fact, it's really focused in Rome. But we also see it very much in Northern Europe, in France, and a heavy amount of it in Spain. Similarly to the Renaissance, we have the same patrons: church, guilds, wealthy families, and civic bodies. But of course, we have a brand new bunch of artists. We're going to be learning about Gian Lorenzo Bernini, perhaps the most famous architect and sculptor of his day. We've got a different Michelangelo. This time we call this artist Caravaggio. He's the most famous painter of the Baroque. We've got the Spanish artist Diego Velázquez. This is where we find Rembrandt. We start to see the rise of women artists such as Lavinia Fontana and Sofonisba. We have probably the most famous of the early female artists, Artemisia Gentileschi. Now, it was the art historian Wolf Lehn that first separated out Baroque art from the Renaissance. He said that the Renaissance art was very much more linear, whereas the Baroque was more painterly. When we look at the Renaissance itself, absolutely, we have line that's very present here. In fact, we have a lot of implied line. People looking in specific directions, lines that are also invisible that are separating the work at the right into registers, where we have God, Mary, and then the apostles. The forms themselves are very solid and three-dimensional, much to the thanks of the technique chiaroscuro. The composition is closed, meaning everything that happens within the border. Light also falls evenly. There's no specific highlighting. Everything looks natural. With the Baroque, forms and outlines tend to merge. It's very difficult to see where one form ends and the next one begins. We have a lot more motion in Baroque works. Because they are theatrical and because we have motion, that's going to be because of the amount of diagonals in the work. We have a seemingly greater amount of depth that is present, not only in the scene at the right, but when we get to the term tenebrism, that's going to be almost infinite depths into blackness. We also have emphasis on light, color, and shadow. And tenebrism is one of those new terms we're going to learn. It's basically chiaroscuro, but a heightened effect. Now, in the first part of our lecture, we're going to be focused on Rome. And this is our first time back in Rome since the sack of Rome in 1527. The Sistine Chapel over here. We've got St. Peter's Cathedral. And these are going to be known as the arms of the church. Back in 64 AD, St. Peter is arrested and eventually martyred on an inverted cross. Emperor Constantine constructs a church on the site of Peter's grave right around the year 300. During the High Renaissance, Pope Julius II rebuilds St. Peter's Cathedral and plans for an elaborate tomb to be placed alongside St. Peter himself. Now, during the Baroque, we have another pope. Pope Paul V begins another major rebuilding project on the cathedral. And when we look at St. Peter's Cathedral, it is created by a number of artists and architects, and it really is kind of a patchwork quilt in a way. The facade was designed by Carlo Maderno, and it is based on the church of Santa Susanna. The dome itself, designed by Michelangelo. The central plan, by the architect Bramante. And the double arcade, that was by Gian Lorenzo Bernini. And you can see these are plain, unadorned Doric columns. The obelisk, that came to Rome in 37 AD. And there's about 140 sculptures up top of the double arcade. Those were constructed by many different artists. And if you go to the Vatican website, it will actually show you the sculpture and the artist who created it. And then we finally have the center of St. Peter's Basilica. And the object that you see in front of you is what's called the baldacchino. So the baldacchino marks the grave of St. Peter, and it really is a lavish grave marker. It is absolutely stunning, especially with the light coming through from the windows of the dome above. It's almost a hybrid, really in between architecture and sculpture. On the underside of the baldacchino, we can see the Holy Spirit. On the flip side, above it, we can see angels, perhaps giving us a sense of heaven. We have these wonderful spiral columns, and they're very reminiscent of the Temple of Solomon. And that's going to be the union of both the Old and the New Testaments. The vine growing on the column is a grapevine, and that is symbolic of the Eucharist. The vine contains laurel leaves throughout, and that is a symbol of the Barberini family. And you can kind of see also on this kind of flap here that there's 3 bees. That is also a symbol of the Barberini family. That is the family of the sitting pope. You also have the papal insignia here. So this work is a basically gigantic propaganda piece. And as you would come up to the baldacchino, this is staring you right in the face, because this is roughly about the 6-foot level here. We have St. Peter's chair there at the left. There's a few of the angels and a little bit closer up of the bees. The symbol of the Pope. And for you to get an idea of scale, the baldacchino itself is roughly 100 feet tall, and it looks very minuscule underneath that dome, figuring the dome is about a little bit over 300 feet tall. In fact, you could put a football field on end and it would not touch the top of the dome. Now with this work here, you can kind of see a sculpture right here on the corner. And this is St. Helen. She's holding the true cross. Up above here is a balcony, and you would have the relic of that saint placed up on the balcony during specific religious holidays. So let's take a look at the different sculptures that are around the baldacchino. First, we have Longinus. This is the Roman soldier who pierced the side of Christ with his spear. He later converted to Christianity. St. Helen, and the true cross. Saint Veronica, with a veil she wipes Christ's face and the imprint stays on the cloth. Then we have Saint Andrew with Saint Andrew's cross. Close by, we also have the tomb of Alexander VII, and this is sculpted by Bernini as well. Bernini is the artist or architect of the baldacchino, and he took over as chief architect of St. Peter's in 1629 when Carlo Maderno passes away. Of all my favorite sculptors, Bernini has to be among the very best. And one of my favorite works that he does is the statue of David. And this is unlike Donatello's version. It's unlike Michelangelo's version. It is life-size, so it's just about 5.5 feet tall. This was commissioned by a pope for one of his nephews, and I put nephew in quotes because the popes are notorious for having nephews, which are many times their illegitimate sons. This one, commissioned by Pope Paul V. The work is incredibly active. You're looking at a wonderful 45-degree angle that this body is slanted in. When we look at diagonals, our brain picks that up as an unstable body position, and that we know change has to be imminent. So we have this wonderful action pose. This sculpture is very dynamic. And when we look at David himself, this is a full-grown man. He is not an adolescent. He is not someone with a vacant stare. He is someone who is very determined. And instead of seeing the before image with Michelangelo or the after image with Donatello, this is a during image where this body is wound up, very much like a Greek sculpture would be. And he is just about to let the slingshot go to throw the rock that is going to hit Goliath. Another great sculpture that he does is Apollo and Daphne. Apollo is pursuing Daphne. She's a wood nymph. She is just about to be caught, but she's been praying to the gods to help facilitate her escape. And they do so by turning her into a tree. So at the very last minute, we can kind of see, and let me turn the sculpture around here. We can see in the image at the right how the body has been encompassed or encased in bark. Her hands are turning into branches and her fingers turning into leaves. It's really this incredible work. And again, it's something like when we look at the Pietà by Michelangelo, we have to think twice that this is stone. And it's amazing what the artist has been able to do with this. So let me read you this paragraph really quick about this sculpture. In its design, in the proportions, in the expression of the heads, in the exquisiteness of all the parts, and in the fineness of its workmanship, it surpasses anything imaginable. In the eyes of the expert and the learned, Bernini's Daphne always was and always will be a miracle of art. Since it is in itself the standard of excellence, I need only say that as soon as it was finished, such acclamation rose that all Rome rushed to view it as though it were a miracle. There's a great close-up of the work. Pluto and Persephone. The artist completed this at the age of 23. And when Pluto kidnaps Persephone and he takes her to the underworld, we have the seasons of fall and winter. When she's released, we have the seasons of spring and summer. We also have Cerberus, that three-headed dog there off to the right. And we can see, whereas Michelangelo's Pietà, the fingers are gently pressing into the dead body of Christ. Here, it's a much more active, vicious act that Bernini is having Pluto conduct. Now, the final work of Bernini's that we're going to take a look at is called Saint Teresa in Ecstasy, and this is placed in the Coronaro Chapel in the Church of Santa Maria della Vittorio in Rome. It took the artist 10 years to complete this work, and just to give you an idea of overall height, we're looking at roughly 11.5 feet. And similar to the baldacchino, We have elements of both sculpture and architecture. Besides that, we have the implementation of color by using light on those gilded rays behind St. Teresa. There's actually, and I think I have this in a later slide, there'll be a little window that you'll be able to see where the sun's coming down, very similar to the windows around the perimeter or the circumference of the dome above St. Peter's Cathedral. So this is very much like a stage set, and the viewers on both sides are members of the Cornaro family. The scene itself is from St. Teresa's account of a vision she had of an angel piercing her body with an arrow repeatedly. Indescribable pain, religious ecstasy, and a sense of oneness with God. And now we're going to move into our very first painter, Caravaggio. He is by far the most famous painter of the Baroque. His paintings contain a heightened sense of realism and dramatic lighting, along with a very theatrical element. He was trained under a little-known pupil of Titian, so at the very end of the Renaissance, we had the very last remnants of it taking place up in Venice. Titian was the most famous artist of that region. So we're looking at just 2 generations removed from Titian, who I would argue is probably the 4th greatest artist of the Renaissance. This guy was both loved and hated as a painter. Young artists absolutely flocked to him because he was doing new and inventive things with painting. However, he absolutely was dismissed by the older established artists. In fact, Vincente Carduccio wrote in his book Dialogue on Painting that Caravaggio was indeed an omen of the ruin and demise of painting. Another art critic called him the Antichrist of painting. Sadly, though, he did have temper issues and ended up killing another artist in a bar fight. And a lot of what we know about Caravaggio comes to us from police records that have been translated. You can find them online, and they're very interesting reading, and they kind of start off like a joke. It literally is Caravaggio walks into a bar, and this is a person who does not hold his liquor very well, and before you know it, he's insulting other artists, bar stools, beer bottles flying across the bar. As mentioned here, he ends up killing another artist. He goes on trial, but he is a celebrity. I mean, this guy is the most famous painter in at least Rome, if not all of Italy. So he gets away with it. He's not sentenced to jail, but the powers that be basically tell him he can't stay in Rome any longer. So he ends up having to roam around southern Italy. And this is kind of the fun part of the story, because today we are finding works by Caravaggio in these small, out-of-the-way churches and towns, because this is where he would take refuge. And in order to pay for room and board, he would paint a scene. He is going to die very young, about 4 years after this expulsion from Rome. He does return for a short time, but he ends up dying at the age of 39. Arriving in Rome about 10 years earlier, he found work as a specialist painter of both fruit and vegetables. This is really all about what a still life is. It's a collection of inanimate objects. But his still lifes were of a much more realistic fashion. You can see here in this work that he shows the diseases such as shot hole fungus in the leaf here. We've got wilting grape leaves. We've got spots on the apple itself. So very much how these truly look. There is no, airbrushing techniques going on here to make this look like a perfect bowl of fruit. When he became a painter on his own, he still continued painting still lives, but all of a sudden there were figures behind them. Caravaggio himself proclaimed that he put as much effort into painting a basket of fruit as the human figure. So we call him the father of still life paintings. In this work here, you can definitely tell that the model for Bacchus was not a professional model. He was literally a farmhand that Caravaggio pulls out of the field. You can kind of see that from the tan itself on both his face and his hand. And in a close-up, we'll look at his fingernails and you can still see there is dirt underneath them. Caravaggio, again, painted exactly what he saw. There is no Greek or Roman depiction of this god. It's everyday reality. This is kind of more of a feminine figure than we would expect, not unlike Donatello's David. We've got this figure with painted lips and arching, seductive eyebrows, offering us wine while toying with the bow that is holding his robe closed. So what statement might the rotting fruit in the still life down below be saying about this scene? Might be saying to enjoy life's pleasures while you can, or avoid the sins of the flesh. And here you can definitely see the dirt underneath the fingernails of that left image. And here's a later work where we've got Caravaggio painting himself as Bacchus. Now, after 1600, pretty much all of his works are of a religious nature. This is Caravaggio's very first public commission. It's located in the Contarelli Chapel in Rome. It's roughly 10 feet by 11 feet, and we still have the contract for this commission. Of course, Caravaggio didn't do what was asked for him in terms of the application of the figures. You know, he's very much a person like Leonardo da Vinci. He's pretty much kind of like do his own thing. We can only guess with the calling of St. Matthew. And we have Christ here off to the right, and we can barely see that halo, very much like that halo around Raphael's Madonna. And he's calling towards St. Matthew, but it's ambiguous as to who St. Matthew is. Is he this person who's counting the money, who is a tax collector? I mean, that's what St. Matthew was before he joined to be an apostle. We've got this older gentleman who's probably more appropriate in terms of age. But we've also got this person, whether he's pointing to himself or the gentleman next to him, we don't know. So again, a lot of ambiguousness about these paintings. And in fact, there's very little indication of religion at all in this work. And keeping that source of light on the right-hand side, that's something we definitely see in the Baroque age. And here's another altarpiece that he completed. And how about this for an altarpiece? The Conversion of St. Paul. It's really an odd angle that we're seeing this painting at. The horse's rear end basically is over the altar. Now, I will also tell you this is the second painting that Caravaggio did for this church. The first one was completely rejected, so he repainted it to this. Once again, we have little or no indication of religion. We don't have the heavenly power that's converting him, and all we see is Paul's response. This is really a painting, an equestrian painting about a horse. And it looks like the horse is about to step on him. Now, I mentioned in the Conversion of St. Paul that Caravaggio was allowed to repaint that work. In this case, he was not allowed to repaint this work, and it was immediately just rejected by the church that had originally commissioned it. Caravaggio, though, had a following, so none of these works ever went to waste. They went to private collectors. Now, everything looks pretty normal here with the death of the Virgin or the death of Mary. However, the model for the Virgin, that was based on a body of a dead prostitute that was fished out of a river. Again, Caravaggio loved to really push the boundaries. And probably my favorite work of his is Supper at Emmaus. This is from the book of Luke. In fact, it's Luke 24, where two apostles meet the resurrected Christ, and it's only at dinner that they realize that it is Christ. But look at what Caravaggio does to the Christ-like figure. He makes it almost very feminine. We've got long curly hair. We have a lack of beard and age to this figure. We have this wonderful dark halo around him, showing betrayal. Our standard still life at the edge. The figures are not sublime or heroic or beautiful. They're just everyday people. And then this is a really common scene in art history, particularly of this age, with Judith beheading Holofernes. I'm going to tell you that story in just a moment when we get to Artemisia Gentileschi's painting of this scene. This is a later work by Caravaggio. The head of Goliath, the severed head there, is a self-portrait of an older Caravaggio. And again, a self-portrait with him as Medusa. And Caravaggio is also noted for completing the very first genre scene. And this is a scene from everyday life, which is basically people who are cheating at playing cards. It's one of my favorite paintings, definitely not commissioned by any church. Now, besides being the father of still life paintings and being the first person to complete a genre scene, Caravaggio in his spare time invented tenebrism. It's defined as dramatic illumination. And when we think back to chiaroscuro, we have this gradual shift in value to make an object look three-dimensional. Well, here with tenebrism, there is nothing gradual about it. It is a drastic, dramatic, overnight shift in value, going from light to dark. It's almost as if spotlight is all of a sudden shining on a dark stage. That's how dramatic it is. And of course, in this age of theatrical paintings, you can kind of think about how it would attract your attention so quickly and add that dramatic element. It was very popular during the 1600s once it was invented. So a lot of times you can definitely tell a tenebrist work is because there's usually one candle. In this case, it's hidden by one person's arm. But that candle illuminates exactly where you're supposed to be looking. And earlier on in this lecture, when I told you about the infinite depths that you'll see in Baroque paintings, this is what I mean by that. You start to get a background that is just dark, and you can't see if that's a wall back there or if it's a doorway or what have you. So we'll take a look at a couple of these tenebrist paintings. And keep in mind, when Caravaggio passes away, he has got a tremendous amount of followers, and those people are known as the Caravaggisti. Among the most famous is Georges de la Tour. And of course, you can see the tenebrist style again. Here we've got the candle mirroring itself in the mirror. So we have kind of this double candle shining on Mary Magdalene's face and the skull that's sitting on her lap. And we get some various glimpses of the jewelry that she has tossed aside on the ground. We also have a lot of the Caravaggisti taking those themes that Caravaggio created, such as card sharps, and doing it in their own style. So again, we have a scene here of people cheating at cards. After Georges de la Tour, we have Orazio Gentileschi, and this is going to be the father of Artemisia. Now, the problem that we have with their association is early on in Artemisia's life, women weren't expected or really allowed to be painters. So while she would paint, many of her works were sold or given the title of her fathers. So even though we have a painting like this today, which we attribute to Orazio, it could very well have been from Artemisia herself. This is what she looked like, and this is her self-portrait, which is so great because it is literally set up to catch her side. It's showing her technical abilities because she had to set up a series of mirrors in order to be able to achieve this type of painting. By the age of 17, she starts producing paintings under her own name. One of the earliest ones is Susanna and the Elders. At the age of 23, she moves from Rome to Florence, where she's elected to the Florentine Academy of Design. One of the subject matters that you'll see painted again and again, not only by her but many people of this age, is the story of Judith and Holofernes. So Holofernes is an Assyrian general. He is attacking the city of Methuselah, which is where Judith lives. Her and her maidservant go out the night before the attack, get him drunk, sever his head, bring it back to the city where they hang it in front of the city doors. So in this image we have the decapitation, and of course we love to make fun of it as well. And we can see Orazio and Artemisia's work side by side. Artemisia's is at the right. And now let's go ahead and move away from Italy and take a look at other parts of Europe. For instance, Spain. The most famous Spanish artist of the day, and one of the most in history, is Diego Velázquez. And this is what he looked like. This is a detail from the painting Las Meninas, which I'll show you in a little bit. Diego Velázquez rose to power, or I should say he became court painter for Philip IV when he rose to the throne at the age of 18. And this happened in 1623. Velázquez himself is going to serve as inspiration for later painters such as Goya, Picasso, and Manet. What's really great about Velázquez is he painted what he saw. Just as Caravaggio would paint a bowl of fruit with that heightened sense of realism, that's what Velázquez had here. The gentleman here happens to be the true water seller of Seville, and you can see definitely the wrinkles in his face, the grayness of his hair. We've got a wonderful textile, and look at the detail in the ceramic that is in the foreground. Even the detail in that glass that he's holding is absolutely exquisite. One of his earlier famous works is Los Borrachos, which translates into the drunkards. And this is just a very unique painting, especially to have in Spain, because to be called a drunkard in Spain is definitely an insult. And you didn't really have drinking shown in Spanish painting. You had it in Flemish painting, and Dutch painting, and Italian painting, but not in Spanish painting. And to me, these faces look so contemporary. You know, it looks like a cigarette advertising here, but it isn't. We've got the god Bacchus crowning these individuals with laurel leaves who are all drunk. And this is a commissioned portrait from the king for his summer house. So you kind of wonder what kind of parties the king threw there. But his claim to fame is this work here. This is Las Meninas. And this is one of the works that I would really have you know for the exam. It is one of the most famous works of all time. It's absolutely gigantic. It is 10.5 feet tall. It's about 8.5 to 9 feet in width. It does hang in the Prado Museum today in Madrid. And it was painted around the last 4 years of Velázquez's life, right around 1656. And he dies in 1660. This is a very private, a very personal, devotional image for the king, because this is the king's family. We've got the Princess Marguerite here, her maids-in-waiting on either side. We've got Velázquez. We've got perhaps a mirror or a painting of the king and the queen. We have the chamberlain for the queen. We have some assistants in the background. We have a dwarf and the court jester. And we also have the king's dog, which is why we view this as a mirror, because this is the most painted dog in art history. There are more paintings of the king and the dog than the king and the queen. So if the dog's here, we know that the king is here. But this work was not even known to the public until the early 1800s. The first time this was put on display was in 1819. But again, we know everyone in this image, and this is a true room that was in the king's home. So here's a little bit larger image of it. And if we were in a classroom setting, I would go around and I would ask you, who or what do you think the focal point is for this work? Because there's lots of great answers to that question. People, of course, first center in on the princess here. She's lighter in color. She's in the very middle of the painting. However, she's not the main focal point. We also have the idea that there's more value contrast around Jose Nieto here in the background. He, again, is not the focal point. Neither is the king and the queen or the painter. The painting itself is named after these two girls. Las Meninas means the maids in waiting. And there's even a scholarly paper saying that the dog is the most important feature in this painting because he's closest to us than any of the other figures. Back early on in this lecture, we talked about open paintings and closed paintings. In Renaissance work, all those paintings were closed. Everything happened within the frame. In this painting, it's open, meaning the subject matter could actually be outside the painting, and the focal point could easily be us, as all these individuals have stopped and are looking out at us. And of course, if we're standing here, we're standing in the presence of the king and the queen, if that is a mirror. And I do argue it is, simply because, and I do have a couple of details of this painting here. Unfortunately, the princess dies fairly young. She dies around the age of 21 or 22 during childbirth. She's married off to a prince from Austria. There's Jose in the background. The king and the queen. And that stripe that you see is not like a bad detail or image taken from a book or anything like that. There were 3 pieces of canvas stitched together to make this large work. And that's what you're seeing is literally the edges of the canvas pieces. There's another of the edges there. But this is why I think that this is a mirror, is because of this painting here. This painting, the Arnolfini portrait, is owned by King Philip IV in the 1600s. And so Velázquez would have had access to it. It was noted already to be a famous painting by this time. And I think in a way he paid homage to Van Eyck by adding his own mirror to the background. As I mentioned, Velázquez is going to serve as inspiration for later artists, and not only for himself, but particularly this painting. Consider this etching of Las Meninas by Goya, and this one by Dali. Picasso's version, and this is a photo montage by Peter Joel Witkin. And these are real people. This is a performance piece done of Las Meninas. And here it is in the Prado Museum. The top of it is damaged from smoke, which is why it's darker and difficult to see the paintings that are above the halfway point, above the stairwell. Those would have been very easily identified. And we also have some street art for that work. Now, moving into the Flemish paintings or Dutch paintings is going to be Peter Paul Rubens. And this image we saw early on in this lecture as compared to Titian's Assumption and Consecration of the Virgin. And this one, of course, being more of an open work, a lot of diagonals, a lot of textiles that are flowing in the wind, and a greater sense of depth to these works. Now, Rubens himself was born in Germany. He had grew up even in Cologne and did a whole bunch of traveling, particularly throughout Italy, and definitely was familiar with the works of Titian, even Tintoretto and Raphael. He did run a large workshop. A lot of these famous artists were teachers. They would run a gigantic workshop and they would be training people who would eventually become famous, like Van Dyck, for instance. One of the cool works he has is The Raising of the Cross, which is his first major commission. The entire work itself is 15 feet high, it's 21 feet wide, and it is 3 separate panels, but it really kind of flows as one image. Kind of see it there in person. In the central panel, we have that extremely strong diagonal, which adds to the motion of the piece, the fluidity. And then we've got these figures that are almost like Michelangelo would have created them. They're very manly, they're very muscular, they're very thick. Over on the, let me get the other image here, it'll be a little bit easier to see. We've got the mourners of Christ at the left and the soldiers who are supervising the execution off to the right. It is very reminiscent to the Greek sculpture of the Laocoon, which is off to the right. Again, that very strong diagonal, those figures that are kind of writhing in pain. And it is very, again, it's a time period where we are looking back at the classical age, the Greek and Roman era, and bringing those ideas forward. Now, the Laocoon sculpture comes to us from the very end of the Greek civilization and the early Roman. You could call it a Hellenistic type of sculpture, which means that it's not that true, very Greek classical, for instance, such as Hermes and Dionysus. He received a lot of commissions from Maria de Medici. In fact, this is one of 21 paintings that she commissioned to really legitimize her ascent to the throne and to rule France as regent. Remember, the Medici family is Italian, and she went to marry Henry IV of France. He dies, she becomes regent, and France just does not like her. So she sets up this series of paintings that really to show the people that, yes, I should be running the country. We have the Medici coat of arms up here, which you saw on the outside of their building and in many of their public artworks. Maria de Medici herself, we've got a whole bunch of Nereids, Neptune and such, to ensure the safe voyage of her ship to France. The work is absolutely gigantic, and you can see it here. This is when it's evacuated from the Louvre in 1939 as the Nazis are invading the city. And now we'll talk a little bit about Rembrandt. Now, Rembrandt, of course, being one of the most famous artists of all time, in fact, he, like Michelangelo and Raphael, are one of the 3 that we really refer to by only his first name. Rembrandt was famous for doing self-portraits throughout his life, and he was a very prolific artist. Unfortunately, though, his personal life was pretty miserable. It was somewhat of a shambles. And when we get to these later portraits, we can see images that are more passive, more resigned. This is a person who, unfortunately, had a lot of his works taken and sold to pay off debts. He had gotten married younger in life to a daughter of a lawyer, and they had a dowry for her. They go off to buy a house, which he never quite pays for, and the wife dies very young. She dies about 8 years after they get married. In 1656, he goes bankrupt, and his house, all his possessions, they go up for auction. And in his final years, he lives in not only poverty but isolation. And this is also, though, one of the reasons he is remembered throughout the ages, because his works were sold off everywhere. Everyone knew about this artist because his works had been sold. They weren't concentrated. They weren't in private collections. They weren't minimized like we would have had with someone like, for instance, Leonardo da Vinci. And here he is in his studio. Perhaps one of the more unique paintings that he does is this one here. It's called the Anatomy Lesson. And you have to remember, back in the 1600s, like this painting was done, this is something that just didn't happen. Anatomy lessons were conducted only by using skeletons. This is literally from about 12 or 13 years after it started being acceptable to use corpses. The corpse here is a hanged gunsmith who had been convicted of a crime. So we've got this work here, and people who attended these lessons were charged very high admittance fees. Those that are in the room, you can see their name written on this page that this person is holding in the background. A little bit different version of Supper at Emmaus than we saw with Caravaggio, and Rembrandt does a couple different styles of these. Again, think about the use of light that we saw. And of course, Rembrandt is mostly known as someone who did prints. We have many of them surviving today, and the work at the right, The Angel Appearing to the Shepherds, is considered one of the most amazing prints ever created. Another Dutch artist that you should be familiar with is Vermeer. And there's not a whole lot that we know about him. He only completed about 36 or 37 paintings. But of course, kind of like with Da Vinci, these paintings are very, very famous. Vermeer himself was somewhat of a recluse. He was a son of a weaver, and he became an art dealer and an innkeeper. This work here was a work taken by Hitler and the Nazi Party during their reign, and it ended up in Hitler's private collection. These paintings aren't very large. They're probably 10 to 12 inches in height and about 6 or 8 inches in width. He's an absolutely brilliant colorist. He's a master of perspective. And if you ever get a chance to watch the documentary called Tim's Vermeer, that is an excellent story about how these works can be created and how Vermeer probably went about painting them with such accuracy. Similar to Rembrandt, though, Vermeer, at his death, his paintings were auctioned off, and he was literally forgotten about as an artist until the late 1800s. Most of his paintings contain one or two people, very modest interiors, but these are well-to-do people. These would also be considered genre scenes. We have a lot of repetition of shapes and such, wonderful color harmonies. And this is allegedly Vermeer's wife. And it's a wonderful painting. You can kind of see that she's pregnant. But in the background, we have the Last Judgment, kind of the end of life, whereas we see her with the beginning of life. She's also weighing some earthly possessions. And in the background, of course, that painting is about weighing of souls. One thing that is very reminiscent about Dutch paintings is the very low horizon line. A couple of weeks ago, we talked about Northern European art, and that had a very high horizon line, very reminiscent of Gothic art. And here it's very much the opposite. This is a real city, and the buildings, though, have been moved around for aesthetic purposes for this painting. And here's Dali's painting of Vermeer. I do want to talk about one last building as we wrap up our lecture, and it was constructed by the architect Borromini. This is the nephew of Carlo Maderno, who was the person who completed the facade of St. Peter's Cathedral. He had also worked in Bernini's workshop. He worked on the baldacchino. However, since Bernini got credit for that work, they kind of split ways. You know, he thought he should have been given some of the credit. He ends up creating this church here, the Church of San Carlo of the Four Fountains. And it's called the Four Fountains because on each of these intersections here, there's a fountain. It is also a very odd-shaped space in which to have a church. And it's definitely not at all like the cross-shaped church that we find in the age of the Renaissance. But look at that front of that church, and it is just amazing because it undulates. Here's kind of the blueprint. The corner of where the fountain is right here. This is the church where you walk in. And of course, we're going to look at the ceiling here. It's kind of oval shaped, but it's very cool and very unique. And look at that undulation, that curvilinear line. Again, definitely lets you know that this work was made during the Baroque age. I think I have a couple more pictures of the different fountains there. So we're going to be moving out of Italy now, and in the 1700s we're going to start to center our work in France. So I will see you next week with a new lecture.